I woke up to the sound of movement in my bedroom. My heart hammered in my chest, instantly wide awake. This wasn't the usual creaking of the house settling or the distant hum of a passing car. It was close. Too close. I knew I wasn't dreaming. The faint glow from the street lamp outside barely made it through the curtains, casting soft, shifting shadows across the room as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. That's when I saw it, a figure by the door.
Tall.
Familiar. My brother. He was standing there, motionless, his hand resting on the doorframe as if frozen in place, mid-step. For a brief moment, I wondered if he was sleepwalking, caught in some kind of dream. But something about his posture, stiff, uneasy, made me second-guess it. My heart raced faster as I sat up, trying to understand why he was in my room at this hour. "Hey," I whispered, my voice shaky and barely louder than my breath. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but I could make out the tension in his jaw, the rigidness of his shoulders, almost unnaturally stiff. There was something in the air between us, charged, like a rubber band pulled too tight, ready to snap. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my words came out uneven, betraying my unease. Still, there was no response. Just as I was about to speak again, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Each movement was careful, almost as if he was testing the ground beneath him. He didn't say a word, but his presence filled the room with an unsettling silence, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to reach out, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by a mix of confusion and fear. Without warning, he was standing at the edge of my bed. Too close. My breath caught in my throat, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold his gaze. But his gaze was distant. Like he was staring through me, seeing something that wasn't really there. Then, without explanation, he leaned in. In that instant, I didn't understand what was happening. 1 second, we were locked in this tense, wordless standoff, and the next, I felt his lips brush mine. A brief, trembling touch, so sudden and out of place that I couldn't even react. I froze, my mind spinning, trying to process what had just happened. What the hell was that? He pulled away just as quickly, stepping back into the shadows with an unreadable expression. It wasn't relief or regret, but something deeper, something more complex, something I couldn't put into words. I'm sorry, he murmured, almost too quietly to hear. I blinked, my brain struggling to catch up. My brother apologizing? For what? For being in my room? For the kiss? For everything that had just unraveled in those few surreal moments? "What are you doing?" I repeated, my voice louder now, harsher, though I wasn't sure if I was angry at him or at myself. "Why are you?" But he was already backing out of the room, shaking his head, retreating as if desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. The door clicked shut behind him with a soft thud, and I was left alone in the dark once again. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, my mind racing through 1,000 different thoughts, none of which made any sense. The whole thing felt unreal, like I'd stepped into some alternate reality where nothing followed the rules. But this was real. I could still feel the warmth of his breath lingering in the air, the faint pressure of his lips on mine. The room felt colder now, colder than it should have been, and yet my skin burned with the memory of that brief, confusing contact. It wasn't just the kiss that unsettled me. It was the way he had looked at me, like he was struggling with something inside himself, some unspoken battle he couldn't escape. And then there was the silence. That heavy, oppressive silence that had wrapped itself around us since the moment I first woke up. I finally got out of bed, my legs shaky and unsure, my mind screaming for answers that didn't come. I glanced at the clock. 3:27 a.m. It was too early for logical explanations, but too late to pretend like none of this had happened. I considered going after him, demanding an explanation, but something held me back. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. It was hesitation. Part of me knew that whatever was going on with him was something I wasn't ready to face, something I wasn't ready to hear. Instead, I sank back into bed, pulling the covers tight around me, as though they could protect me from the strangeness of the night. My heart was still pounding, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions, but nothing brought me any closer to understanding. The silence in the house had returned, but it felt different now, tense, fragile. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something else to break. And I couldn't help but wonder, what was he thinking? Why now? And most importantly, what happens next? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of what had happened. It clung to me like a shadow, impossible to ignore. Every time I tried to focus on something else, making coffee, folding laundry, even brushing my teeth, my mind snapped back to the previous night. To him, standing there in the dark. To that kiss. Brief, yet impossible to forget. I heard him moving around the house, and my stomach tightened. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. What could I even say? Maybe he'd pretend it hadn't happened. Maybe he was just as confused as I was. Or maybe, worst of all, he had done it deliberately, waiting for me to bring it up. I stayed in my room longer than usual, pacing in small circles, as if somehow that would help me figure out what to do. But nothing came. Every time I imagined going downstairs, my chest tightened, my heart began to race. Eventually, the silence told me he had left the house. I exhaled, relieved but also disappointed. I couldn't make sense of my own feelings. When I finally made my way downstairs, the house felt too quiet. I half expected to find a note, an explanation, something that would make sense of it all. But there was nothing. Just the lingering scent of his cologne and the faint warmth in the kitchen where he'd made his own breakfast and gone. I sat at the table, staring blankly at my untouched cup of coffee. What was I supposed to do now? Call him? Text him? Pretend none of this had happened and hope things would just go back to normal? My head was spinning, filled with questions that had no answers. But I knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. Before I could decide, I heard the door open. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized he was back. There was no more time to think. No more room to hide. I braced myself for whatever awkwardness lay ahead. But when he walked into the kitchen, he looked normal.
Calm.
As if nothing strange had happened between us just hours before. Morning, he said casually, heading toward the fridge like it was just another ordinary day. His voice was steady, without a hint of the tension from the night before. Was he seriously going to act like nothing had happened? I swallowed hard, my words sticking in my throat. Morning, I replied, my voice softer than I meant for it to be. I watched as he poured a glass of water, his movements smooth and easy, like everything was just fine. But it wasn't fine. Not for me. I couldn't stand the silence, the way he was pretending like nothing had changed. The longer I sat there, the more the pressure built inside me, pushing against my chest until I thought I might burst. I had to say something. Anything. You were in my room last night. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the quiet kitchen like a blade. He froze, his glass halfway to his mouth, the room suspended in an eerie silence. I know, he said after what felt like an eternity. He lowered the glass slowly, still not turning to face me, and set it down on the counter with a soft thud. My heart raced. He knew exactly what he had done. And yet, he hadn't said a word about it. Was he embarrassed? Ashamed? Or was it something deeper, something more complicated? My mind raced with questions, none of which brought me any clarity. You kissed me, I said, my voice firmer this time. There was no point in skirting around it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know what had happened. He finally turned to face me, his expression unreadable. Yeah, he admitted quietly, his eyes dropping to the floor.
Why?
The question escaped before I could stop it. It wasn't just curiosity. I had to know. I had to understand what was going through his mind. He rubbed the back of his neck, something he always did when he was uncomfortable, and suddenly, he didn't seem so distant. He wasn't the unreadable figure from last night. He was the brother I had known my entire life, the one I trusted. Even now, despite everything. I don't know, he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. I don't know what I was thinking. I'm sorry. Sorry? I repeated, trying to make sense of what he was saying. It didn't add up. None of this made sense. What do you mean you don't know? I asked, my voice shaking as I searched his face for some sign of understanding. He sighed, finally meeting my eyes, and in that moment, I saw something unexpected, vulnerability. Something raw, something real that I wasn't prepared for. It just happened, okay? He said, his words coming out in a rush. I wasn't thinking. I don't know what came over me. We stood there in silence, the weight of his apology hanging in the air, thick with unspoken words. My mind was a blur, trying to make sense of it all. His apology wasn't enough, but at the same time, it felt like too much. Finally, I shook my head, pushing my chair back with a screech that filled the stillness of the kitchen. I need to go, I muttered, my voice shaky as I grabbed my keys from the table. Wait, he called after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I needed to get out, to breathe, to think. The last thing I heard before I slammed the door behind me was his voice, soft and filled with regret. I'm sorry. I drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 30 minutes. The road stretched out before me, empty and winding, flanked by trees that seemed to close in the farther I went. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, but no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I couldn't outrun the confusion swirling inside me. The events from last night and this morning replayed over and over in my head, like a loop I couldn't escape. The look in his eyes when I asked him why. The way he said he didn't know. The regret that had lingered in the air between us. It was all too much. Too overwhelming. My brother, the one person I had trusted more than anyone, had crossed a line, and now everything felt off, like the world had shifted on its axis, and I was struggling to regain my footing. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the road opened up. This part of town was quieter, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. I used to come here when I needed to clear my mind, back when things were simpler. Before all of this, I pulled off the road into a small gravel parking lot near an old hiking trail. The trees were taller here, their branches swaying gently in the wind. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe. I hadn't planned to come here, but it felt right, like I needed to be somewhere no one could find me, even if it was only for a few hours. I locked the car and grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, shoving it into my jacket pocket. The thought of turning it off crossed my mind, but I left it on just in case. I didn't want to hear from him. Not now. Not after everything. But a part of me knew that eventually, I'd have to face this. I just wasn't ready yet. The trail wound through the trees, narrow and overgrown, but I'd walked it so many times before that I didn't need to focus on the path. My legs moved automatically, carrying me farther into the woods, farther from everything that had happened. At first, the quiet was comforting. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. It was the kind of peaceful escape I usually craved. But today, the quiet wasn't enough to drown out the thoughts in my head. I tried to think logically, to make sense of what had happened. It was a mistake, he'd said. He didn't know why it had happened. But was that enough? Could I just chalk it up to confusion? Or was this the start of something much bigger? Something that would change everything between us? The trail eventually led to a small clearing where a fallen tree had created a makeshift bench. I sat down, feeling the rough bark beneath me, and buried my face in my hands. The weight of it all pressed down on me, suffocating, like the forest itself was closing in. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something to release the pressure building in my chest. But nothing came. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before unlocking it. No messages. No missed calls. A small part of me had expected him to try and reach out, but the silence was louder than any words could have been. Maybe he was giving me space. Or maybe he didn't know what to say. I didn't know which was worse. I opened the messaging app and started typing. My fingers moved faster than my mind could keep up with. Asterisk. Asterisk.
Me.
Asterisk. Asterisk. I stared at the words for a second, then deleted them. What was I hoping to get from him? What could he say that would make any of this better? I tried again. Asterisk. Asterisk.
Me.
Asterisk. Asterisk. Why did you do it again? I deleted the message before hitting send. The question had already been asked, and his answer had been vague. Unsatisfying. I didn't need to hear it again. What I needed was something else, something I couldn't quite articulate. A gust of wind blew through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, frustrated with myself for even trying to communicate. I wasn't ready.
Not yet.
Leaning back against the fallen tree, I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the forest around me. The rustle of the leaves, the distant chirp of birds. This was supposed to help. Being out here, away from everything, had always given me clarity before. But now, even nature couldn't quiet the storm inside me. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. Eventually, I stood up, needing to move. My legs ached as I began the walk back down the trail. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. The air had grown colder, and I zipped up my jacket, hugging my arms to my chest as I walked. I hoped the motion would distract me, maybe even warm me, but it didn't. As I reached the car, the weight of everything pressed down even harder. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't avoid him forever. We lived in the same house. I'd have to face him again. And what then? Would we pretend this never happened? Could we go back to the way things were? Or would the tension between us continue to fester, making everything unbearable? I leaned against the hood of the car, staring out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I pulled it out, half expecting his name to flash across the screen. But it wasn't him. It was a message from a friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. Want to grab coffee sometime soon? The normalcy of the message felt jarring, like the world was moving on, while I was stuck in some uncomfortable limbo. I didn't respond. Instead, I climbed into the car and started the engine, the hum of the vehicle filling the silence that had been with me all day. As I drove back toward the city, my thoughts spun in endless circles, always returning to the same questions. What happens next? I got home just as the sun was setting, the golden light spilling through the windows, casting everything in a warm, almost unreal glow. The house felt unnervingly quiet. I knew he was there, somewhere, waiting. The tension from earlier hung thick in the air, an oppressive weight. I wanted to ignore it, retreat to my room, pretend this hadn't happened. But I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it. Not like this. I found him in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. He didn't look up when I entered, but I could feel the shift in the room as soon as he realized I was there. "Hey," I said, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady. Finally, he looked up. There was a tiredness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Maybe we were both worn out from all the unspoken words hanging between us. "I've been thinking," I said, walking over to stand by the window. I could see his reflection in the glass, his eyes fixed on me, waiting. "Do you remember how we used to go riding when we were kids?" A faint smile flickered across his face, and for a brief moment, the tension between us seemed to ease. "Yeah," he said softly. "You used to love it. We'd spend hours at the stables." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I miss that," I admitted. "I miss how simple things used to be. Just you, me, and the horses."
"No worries. No complications."
He glanced away, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. "It was easier back then," he said quietly, his voice distant, like he was already somewhere far away in his mind. There was a long pause. I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say what had been weighing on me all day. "I was thinking maybe we could go riding again," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I know it's been a while, but—" I trailed off, unsure of how to finish. I wasn't even sure why I was asking. But something inside me longed for that sense of normalcy, for the comfort of being close to him, without all the confusion. He looked up at me, clearly surprised. "You want to go riding? After everything?" I shrugged, trying to keep my voice casual, though I could feel how much the idea meant to me.
"Yeah.
I mean, why not? We used to have fun, right? I miss that. I miss us." For a moment, I thought he might say no, but then he nodded slowly, his expression softening. All right, let's go riding. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the hope that for just a few hours, we could forget everything and return to something familiar. Something that made sense. The next morning, we drove to the stables in near silence. The tension from the past few days was still between us, lingering in the space we shared. I kept glancing at him, hoping to see some sign that things might be normal again. But his face remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As we pulled up to the barn, the sun was just rising, casting a soft glow over the fields. It felt like stepping into a different time, one where things had been simpler, uncomplicated. The smell of hay and leather, the quiet snorts of horses in their stalls. Everything about this place felt familiar, like stepping back into a memory. We walked inside, and the memories came flooding back. This had been our refuge, a world that belonged only to us. Back then, it was always me who dragged him out here, eager to spend hours riding through the fields. He never complained. In his own quiet way, I think he enjoyed it too. The stable hands greeted us with warm smiles, remembering us from all those years ago. It was strange being back here, like returning to a place that should have stayed locked in the past. But at the same time, it felt comforting. We were soon saddled up and ready to go. The horses were calm beneath us, their steady breathing a welcome distraction from the knot of emotions I couldn't untangle. We rode out onto the familiar trail, the sound of hooves crunching against the dirt the only thing breaking the silence. At first, neither of us said much. The quiet stretched between us, but it didn't feel suffocating. It felt safe, like we were both waiting for something to shift. Or maybe just waiting for the right words. As we reached the clearing, the one where we used to race as kids, I found the courage to speak. "It's been a long time," I said, glancing over at him. He nodded, his face softening.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how much I missed this. I smiled, letting the familiar rhythm of the ride settle my nerves. It feels good, like things used to be. But even as I said the words, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Things weren't like they used to be. We weren't those carefree kids anymore. And whatever had changed between us, whatever had shifted in the space between us, wasn't something that could be undone by a simple ride through the countryside. For now, though, I wanted to hold on to the illusion, even if it was only for a little longer. We continued riding for another hour, speaking in fits and starts, mostly about nothing of consequence. The weather, the horses, random memories from our childhood. And for the first time in days, things almost felt normal. Almost. Eventually, we stopped at the top of a small hill that overlooked the valley below. The view took my breath away. The rolling fields, dotted with trees, stretched on endlessly into the horizon. We got off our horses, letting them graze nearby while we sat on the grass side by side, but without touching. There was an invisible weight between us, a quiet tension filled with unspoken things. But neither of us seemed ready to voice them. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't want things to be like this," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know what happened, but I hate how distant we've become." I stared at my hands, the familiar ache in my chest returning. "Me too," I admitted softly, "but I don't know how to fix it." He sighed, running his fingers through his hair. "Maybe it's not something we can fix. Maybe this is just how things are now." I swallowed hard, unwilling to accept that. I didn't want to believe that the closeness we once shared was lost forever. But deep down, I knew he was right. Something had changed between us, something deep and irreparable. And no amount of riding through the fields would bring it back. We sat there for a long while, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, neither of us knowing what to say. The silence around us felt heavier than ever. The horses grazed lazily nearby, the only sound the rhythmic crunching of grass beneath their teeth. I could almost feel the weight of his words pressing on me, their finality. "Maybe this is just the way things are now," I said quietly, though part of me refused to accept it. I wasn't ready to let go of what we had, even if it was slipping away, piece by piece. I wish things could go back to the way they were, I added, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was speaking to him or just to myself. Back when everything was simpler, I trailed off, unable to finish. He didn't respond, and I didn't dare glance at him. Instead, I kept my eyes on the horizon, on the distant hills that felt like they belonged to a different world altogether. The sun was now high in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that we were just two people sitting in the sun, and nothing had changed. But that was a lie. I felt him shift next to me, his body tense, like he was about to say something important. I held my breath, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. I miss it too, he said at last, his voice low and rough. But I think we're different people now. You and me. We can't go back. Not even if we wanted to. I bit my lip, fighting back the lump in my throat. I knew he was right, of course he was. But hearing it out loud didn't make it any easier. Do you regret it? I asked before I could stop myself. My heart pounded, and the question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. For a moment, he didn't answer. I could feel my pulse racing, the anticipation of his response almost unbearable. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had settled on them. I don't know, he admitted. Sometimes I think I do. But other times, no. Maybe this was bound to happen. His words hit me harder than I expected. Bound to happen, was it really? Had this been inevitable? All along, without either of us realizing it? I turned to look at him, searching his face for something, for any sign that he was just as lost as I was. But what I saw in his eyes wasn't confusion, wasn't regret. It was something else. Something deeper. Something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it's better if we take a break, he said softly, almost to himself. Maybe some space will help us figure things out. My heart sank, the words landing like a stone.
Space.
A break. It all sounded so final, so cold. And yet, I couldn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe we did need time apart to process everything that had happened, to gain some clarity. Maybe we needed distance to see things in a new light. But as I sat there, staring at him, I realized something else. Space wouldn't fix this. It wouldn't undo what had happened between us. Whatever had shifted had changed us both in ways we couldn't take back. And no matter how far we ran, that change would follow us. Always. I stood up, brushing the grass from my jeans, and turned to face him. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in ages, I saw the boy I used to know, the one who'd always been there, the one I could count on. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man I no longer understood. I think you're right, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Maybe space is what we need. He nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes that told me he wasn't as certain as he sounded. Yeah, maybe. We stood there for a moment, the distance between us growing with every second of silence. The wind rustled through the trees, and the horses shifted restlessly in the field. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, without thinking, I stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't long, and it didn't solve anything. But it felt like goodbye, even if we hadn't said the words. I pulled away, the sting of unshed tears behind my eyes, and without another word, I turned and started walking back toward the stables. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of his footsteps faded behind me, and with each step, something inside me began to unravel. Maybe this was for the best. Maybe this was how it had to be. But as I reached the stable door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A text from him. I miss us already. I stared at the words, my heart twisting in my chest. I wanted to reply, to say something, anything, that would make this feel better. But no words came. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked inside.
No.